Good afternoon. Based on scientifically known facts, COVID-19 is spread in a way that has become a global phenomenon. And we can only imagine that no country is safe based on what we see currently if COVID-19 is somewhere else on the globe. For this reason, I believe that a response which is global in scope is necessary. Here in Washington, D.C., a group of NGOs have been advocating for a more global response to this pandemic. Joining me to discuss this is Alex Main and Don Weavett, Isaac Evans, and Sarah Burns. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I would like to ask all of you to tell me what have you been doing in terms of mobilizing this global response, starting with Sarah, please.
Thank you, Bahati. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm representing Just Foreign Policy, and since the pandemic was first announced in the United States, we have been gathering, that since March of this year, to try to find a global response to the pandemic, to see what we could best do to assist brothers and sisters in the developing world get access to what they need the most. And we determined with their input that it was access to special drawing rights through the IMF. And so we've been campaigning to find ways for the US government, that is in particular the Department of the Treasury and the US Congress, to support the issuance of special drawing rights for every nation truly that is in need to fight the pandemic. That's it in a nutshell.
Many people are not familiar with the concept of special drawing rights. Is this a loan? What is the difference between the special drawing rights and the loan? Alex.
Well, sure. So special drawing rights, they're not a loan. They don't need to be repaid by countries. They are assets that sit in central bank reserves, and they're produced by the International Monetary Fund and by the decision of the majority of the members of the International Monetary Fund. And essentially they are very, very useful in a situation like the one that the world is dealing with now, where there's a twin crisis. There's a public health crisis, of course, but then there's also the economic fallout of the public health crisis due to the containment measures that are being taken in countries throughout the world. And so dealing with both of these things requires a huge deployment of resources by governments. And wealthy countries tend to have these resources. And we've seen, obviously, in the US and in European countries, for instance, big stimulus programs to help the sectors that have been hit the hardest by the pandemic and to boost domestic demand in those countries. They also have the resources to purchase, the protective equipment, vaccines, and so on. Very often, poor countries don't have the necessary resources. So, yeah, I would say low-income, middle-income countries in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on often don't have these resources. Mm-hmm. And institutions like the IMF have provided funding, but it's not enough. They've provided traditional loans, but it's not enough. And so these special drawing rights can be a big help in dealing with this situation. They're assets that are transferred from the IMF to the central banks of each countries, and they can either sit in accounts of the central banks or they can be used to be traded in for hard currency, for dollars, euros, etc. And this is of enormous help right now. And this was last done in 2009, very successfully. And it could happen again if the US supports it. The rest of the world essentially supports doing this. So we now need to see leadership from the US. And that's why we're all engaged in advocacy around this issue here in Washington, D.C.
Yes, you say that wealthy nations can afford to help out their citizens. And we just learned that the US Congress just passed a stimulus package to assist the economy of here in the US. And we were hoping that special drawing rights will be attached to this stimulus package, but it did not happen. Ivan, can you tell you what went wrong and what is it that went wrong?
So, Bahati, my name is Isaac, and I'm the director of Action Corps, which is a humanitarian advocacy organization that grew out of Oxfam. And what we saw is, in talking to about a third of the Senate offices, and the majority of those being Republican offices, we saw that there was real interest in special drawing rights and issuance of these emergency financial resources. And right now, the US is blocking this issuance, this life-saving resource that wouldn't cost the US taxpayers a penny. And what we saw from Republican offices, there was interest in this, but there was a lot of deferring. So a lot of the Republican offices were deferring to Chairman Risch of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who in turn was deferring to the Treasury Department, who in turn may have been deferring to the US Senate Republicans. So there was a lack of leadership is what I saw. And at the end of the day, it seemed that there was fear of stepping on the toes of anyone else, and there was a deference and this continual deference to one another and a leadership void. So we are really optimistic about moving forward under a new administration and with a new Congress, and think there's a real shot at this. We can build on the success that we've already seen. The fact that the US House of Representatives twice this year passed this legislation, we've had a very positive reaction from many Senate Republican offices. We think that we have a good shot at moving legislation for a global stimulus forward in the coming year.
Don, I understand that SDRs would also help the economy of the United States besides this, in addition to the stimulus package. So can you tell us how would the issuance of SDRs support and sustain the US economy as well?
You bet. Thanks for asking that. I work with farmers in Iowa. I am an Action Corps volunteer in Iowa, and also I am on the board of the Iowa Farmers Union. The interesting thing is that rather than seeing this divided along political lines, in my area of expertise in farming, we get Republicans and Democrats. For instance, the fellow who's the treasurer of the Iowa Corn Growers was also working with us at one point. So it's a big tent. The reason is we are tied to the overall economy. When there is a collapse of the economy or of the supply chains within the economy, as we experienced with COVID, when actually food supplies were disrupted even in North America, that has a direct impact on smaller farmers as well as the large ones. The large ones are participating in the export economy and could benefit directly from the issue of SDRs as they export food and grains to other countries or soy products. Because as these countries need the SDRs to shore up their currency reserves, they will ultimately use that credit, their ability to print currency, to buy food for their people, and that food could come from the United States. So for smaller farmers, they just need the world economy to work. We don't live on government subsidies. We don't get checks from the government, even on COVID, our COVID relief checks. We are dependent upon the overall health of the American economy.
Very good. Now, based on that, there are people we want who have been championing this cause, and we want to bring more people into the midst so that they can also support the cause so that it can go forward. Sarah, can you talk to us about who has been really the champion for this cause and who else do we need to bring in?
That's an excellent question, Bahati, because we have been overwhelmed by the amount and outpouring of support from the faith-based community throughout the United States. We have representatives from so many different religious denominations that it's heartwarming to see the concern and the care that people are exhibiting. The problem is The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who is a Catholic himself, doesn't seem to have gotten the message from, for instance, that the Pope is spreading, which is to look out for the poorest of the poor during this pandemic. So we need more support, in particular from our colleagues in Idaho and members of the Senate, in particular Republican members of the Senate, who can convey the significance of this piece of legislation, wherever it may end up being inserted. It has to happen because, as Isaac has said, it costs the U.S. taxpayer nothing. So this is a way to respect the social justice and the human rights components of helping people in the developing world who so desperately need this. We know how bad it is in the United States. We can only imagine how it is elsewhere with fighting this pandemic.
Indeed, in Africa, I know there is people live off informal sectors, and it's very, very hard. Now, we know that some members of Congress have said that they are skeptical in issuing these special drawing rights, and probably they do not want this money to be used for other purposes than COVID-related impact. What's your take on this, Alex?
So yes, I mean there are cases, where there are countries, for instance, that haven't been as directly affected by COVID-19. We've seen this in some countries of Africa, for instance, thanks to good measures and also obviously experience with things like the Ebola pandemic, not so long ago. But I think, what U.S. legislators need to understand is that whether or not you're hit hard by the pandemic, you're going to be hit economically because we're in a globalized economy. There is a really significant economic downturn globally, the biggest one since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And of course, many African economies rely on, the global demand for their exports, for their commodities to keep afloat. And that demand has sunk. And as a result, we're seeing, economic downturns that are very significant in, African countries as well, and including those not hit as hard by the pandemic directly. So, they certainly need the additional resources to cope with, the economic situation. There's also the issue that's brought up of, potential moral hazard that, SDRs can go to corrupt and autocratic governments. And, to be honest, yes, some of these assets can end up being misused by some countries. But on the whole, the countries of the world are facing such very dire crises that I think we can expect the vast majority of these resources to be mobilized to help address the pandemic and to help with all of these economic challenges. And I think something that's a rough analogy is really what's happened in the US with the CARES Act, with all of these stimulus checks that went out, $1,200 checks to, the vast majority of US citizens. There was nothing that could prevent those people from using that cash for purposes that we may disapprove of. They could use it, to buy drugs, to buy guns, to buy it for things that really have nothing to do with the pandemic. And there were probably cases of that happening, but I think everyone recognizes at this point, certainly in the US, that by and large, these funds were of enormous help to families in need throughout the country and to the US economy in general. And so it's similar with SDRs, with the difference, I think, that governments, even the corrupt authoritarian governments, are generally more accountable to the public than private individuals are. And so I think, the abuse of these funds would be a very marginal phenomenon and shouldn't be a reason for, preventing countries from receiving these resources.
Yes. Anyone else want to have a stab on this argument about abuse of these funds, and these funds being a wonderful, sweet gift to authoritarian regime. Anyone else, please?
I would defer to Alex or to Isaac, but there were examples from the 2009 issuance where there were countries that have been identified by our country as rogue nations, where they actually did not deploy the SDRs issued to them because of the sanctions that have been levied against them. I think we could speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Isaac, do you have any comment?
Yeah, I just think that the point is that that SDRs, or special drawing rights, are an emergency financial resource that's not cash. So it's not humanitarian assistance in the way that we think of it. It's really addressing a bigger macro problem and helping stabilize the global economy, which is going to particularly benefit people living in poverty. So it's a little bit of a shift from how a lot of us humanitarians think about assistance, because it's assistance for the global economy, and it will help change the course of history for millions of poor people living around the world. And I want to give an example, which is just that right now we know that according to UNICEF, the COVID pandemic is resulting in the starvation of an additional 10,000 children every month. That's it. Around the world, 10,000 children more children are starving to death as a result of this pandemic. And that's largely because of the economy. And so if we don't provide a global COVID response economically, we're going to continue to see huge loss of life. And this is an opportunity that we have by supporting Senate Bill 4139 and pushing for major issuance of special drawing rights under the new administration of the new Congress for us to move this forward. So if people want to help, they can go to globalcovidresponse.org and click on the Take Action tab to communicate with their legislators.
Yes, Sarah, you know that the power of government is in the people's hands. As advocates, we mobilize. So what should people do next, and what is our plan?
I think that people should recognize that these efforts that we are describing today have been supported by heads of state, ministers, economists globally. So it really depends on the power of the people in the United States to reach out to the members of the Senate. As it has been said, we've already passed legislation 2 times in the House of Representatives. So it's in the hands of the Senate where we can truly make a difference. Both Democrats and Republicans should be educated. The amount of time that has to go into educating people about the truth of this concept, how it costs the US taxpayers nothing, and how it will only support the global economy, has to be stressed time and time again. But people are very much invited to join us, as has been said. Check out the website and join our campaign, and you can reach out to your senators and help explain to them why this is so important.
Indeed, thank you so much. It has been clear, and we know that the US is the only country that we think can unlock this problem. And anyone wants to make that case that yes, the US has the key to this problem. Anyone?
Sure. So, very quickly, basically, nearly the entire world is in support of this SDR issuance. You have the managing director of the IMF, you have European allies, you have African governments, Latin American governments. All of them are supporting this as the logical thing to do to help the global economy and to help developing countries. The US, however, has a controlling vote in this decision. The decision needs to be passed with an 85% vote. The US has a quota share of over 16% of votes at the IMF, which allows it to block this decision, and that's what's happened. So that's why it's really essential for Congress to be involved, the US Congress, as well as an additional limitation that's in US legislation that requires that Congress approve an amount that goes beyond a certain threshold. I think economists are generally in agreement that the amount that is currently available to the US Treasury on its own to push for is not sufficient, and therefore the Congress needs to intervene. And that's why this legislation exists. And I just want to point out to the people listening that there's a very good website where you can find more resources on all of this. It's global COVID response in one word .org, globalcovidresponse.org. You can find many more resources that explain in detail how SDRs work, and also let you know about the support that exists, the congressional legislation that's on the table, and also how to engage and become involved in this campaign for SDRs as well.
Yes, thank you so much. Alex, which organization are you affiliated with, please?
Thank you. I think I forgot to mention that. I'm at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. We do a lot of work on international financial issues and have been supporting SDRs to help with the pandemic economic situation since March of this year.
Indeed, you are an authority on these issues. Don, which organization are you part of, please?
I am with Action Corps and also the Iowa Farmers Union.
Wonderful. Isaac, what is your organization?
Action Corps.
Action Corps. And Sarah, which organization are you part of?
I'm with Just Foreign Policy.
Wonderful. This is Bahati Jacques. I am a policy analyst with the Africa Faith and Justice Network. Please join us as we continue to fight for the livelihood of many people and to save the global economy from the effect of COVID-19. Thank you, and we will see you next.
Thank you.
Bahati, thank you for your efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you.